everyone. I'm thrilled to welcome you here this afternoon to our Roski talk. And I'm super delighted that we have today Diedrick Brackens, who is joining us from LA. He's a professor at Cal State Long Beach and also a magnificent artist. And Emma Christ, our graduate student, is going to introduce him in just a moment. So first, I just wanted to make an announcement to remind you all that we have 3 remaining Roski talks of the season. On March 31st, we have our very own Professor Amelia Jones, scholar and curator, who will be talking about the Ron Athey exhibition that just opened in New York City. Afterwards, we will have on April 14th, Gabriela Urtiaga, the curator at the Museum of Latin American Art, coming to speak with us. And then on April 21st, we will have artist and professor of art at UC Irvine, Simon Liang, joining us. So a fantastic fabulous 4 to finish us off of the semester. And we look forward to hearing from Diedrick today and the other folks in the coming weeks. So without much further ado, I'm going to hand it over to Emma Christ, who is our MA student in the Curatorial Studies program in the public sphere here in USC's Roski program, to introduce Diedrick. Thank you, Emma.
Thank you, Jenny. So Diedrick Brackens is best known for his woven tapestries that explore allegory and narrative through the artist's autobiography, broader themes of African-American and queer identity, as well as American history. Brackens employs techniques from West African weaving, quilting from the American South, and European tapestry making to create both abstract and figurative works. Often depicting moments of male tenderness, Bracken calls from African and African-American literature, poetry, and folklore as source. Beginning his process through the hand dyeing of cotton, a material he deliberately uses in acknowledgement of its brutal history, Bracken's oeuvre presents rich, nuanced visions of African-American life and identity, while also alluding to the complicated histories of labor and migration. Brackens utilizes both commercial dyes and atypical pigments such as wine, tea, and bleach to create his vibrant, intricately woven tapestries that investigate historical gaps, interlacing the present with his singular, magical realist worldview. Brackens received his Master's of Fine Arts from California College of the Arts in San Francisco, and his work is included in collections at the Hammer Museum of Contemporary Art in Los Angeles, the Whitney Museum of American Art, and the Studio Museum in Harlem. We're very glad to have you today joining us, so thank you so much.
Thank you all. Thank you for that great introduction. Good to see familiar faces. I'm so excited. Just gonna open my talk. So I'm just going to talk about some recent bodies of work and exhibitions, and then I'm going to show some older works at the end just to think about currents that are still valent in my practice, and as a way to think about sort of where the work might be moving towards and away from, all these sorts of things. So I'd like to start with a little bit of process. So this is a sketch of a work that I made recently called Through the Summer Triangle. And I like to show the sketches just to get a sense of what they look like, what I imagine them to look like in my head, and sort of the fallout between the translation of drawing to weaving. But I start with a kind of collage sensibility where I work together images that I've taken, found from various sources, drawing, but eventually these drawings get blown up to the scale of the work. So in this case, it's a 6-foot weaving, and then I take those drawings and go back in and work out some of the kind of particulars or take things away and add things. So the previous sketch was for an exhibition called Arc of Bulrushes that is on view at the Scottsdale Museum of Contemporary Art currently. In the first kernels of that exhibition, I was really looking at the history of American quilting and how it is bound up in this history and mythology of using quilts to navigate the Underground Railroad. And there are a lot of scholars and textile historians and quilters who've done a lot of research and sort of have decided as a organized body that there's not enough evidence to support whether or not this happened. And to me, what I find compelling is not necessarily this idea of truth, but that the truth is Black Americans have decided that there was space and sort of inside textiles and textile making to embed meaning, to make codes, to provide a sense of authorship and authority to a group of people who would not have largely been able to read and write, and that this is the story that we've carried forward to think about self-liberation. And I think that that is compelling, and to build on that myth or truth is a kind of project that I'm invested in. So the quilt pattern embedded in this weaving is called the North Star. So you get that great eight pointed star. And the code that was supposed to be embedded is a directive to follow the North Star to an eventual freedom. So in this exhibition, I also made a group of sculptures and photographs. And so the sculptures were these baskets, and the photographs were capturing them out in the landscape, and thinking about sort of filling a gap in the narrative that we have access to, and really thinking about what other forms of craft could have been used as a means of liberation, or navigation or movement through an otherwise sort of unfriendly or unwelcoming landscape. And I really started to think about making these baskets while I was thinking about the myth of Moses in particular. And for those unfamiliar, Moses' mother, this biblical figure, Moses, his mother puts him into a basket and seals it up and floats it down a river to save his life from the enslaving Egyptians who would have killed him for being born son of these enslaved folks. And I was really drawn to this story because Christianity is so overlaid the American story and history. And if you look at the course of the Mississippi River in particular, there are all these ways that that landscape has been synchronized with Egypt, so that cities that run the course of this river share Egyptian names, like Memphis or Alexandria or Goshen. And so even in our founding, we really, as a country, started to identify with these biblical places and narratives. And the sort of friction for me is that white enslavers and these Black enslaved folks would have been sharing these same stories, and also very much thinking of themselves as the Israelites, or in the Bible, the chosen ones. So to identify with folks across time and history who were enslaved and be free and enslaved is this kind of strange thing to reconcile, the ways that what that might mean. So the kind of starting place for me was that both of these folks sharing this space and time would have access to this story and been able to extrapolate to such a device as a basket that might carry someone through the world. So the crawling star signals takes the quilt pattern of bear paw, which is thought to have been meant to tell someone to follow the mountain path, or follow in the tracks of a bear, to avoid being sighted by someone who might have tried to recapture, or bring any other kind of harm to them. And I think a lot about um, how marginalized and queer folks navigate the world, sort of picking one set of dangers over another, sort of trying to decide what in harm reduction in order to stay alive or to stay safe. And the figures in these weavings, including um, the survival is a shrine, the first weaving that I showed, they really mimic the shape of the constellation or the star that they are also making reference to. So while making reference to the bear paw quilt pattern, it also is thinking about Ursa Major, or the Big Dipper, as we call it. So these figures sort of articulate those constellations. And as I started to make the photographs in the baskets, I really um, got to extend what the studio was, what my practice looked like, and where it took place. So I think while being out in these these landscapes, these settings, I started to see how the world was offering up to me these things that I was considering in these kind of sanitized locations. So I found this stand of reeds, which is literally the material I've been making these baskets with the whole time, and really started to have this kind of co-conspirator in making meaning of the show and in nature, and re-understanding the material that was kind of coming from this space. And so the baskets became boats. They became these sort of modes of camouflage or containers for the body. I think We Inherit the Labyrinth is one of my favorite pieces from this exhibition. Namely, it's the articulation of this particular quilt pattern, which one of its names is Drunkard's Path. I loved how organic this pattern is, how it doesn't rely just on triangles and squares, but has this kind of flowing Brancusi-like shape. And the One of the things that I sort of was thinking through is the myth of Ariadne, who is this figure who gives a questing hero a ball of yarn to navigate his way into and out of the labyrinth to slay the Minotaur. And I think that ball of yarn becomes kind of the kind of end point for me is weaving that yarn becomes enmeshed, and that backwards and forwards, or that sort of circulating through the labyrinth, and so it becomes the map. It becomes the set of tools that we use to navigate the world. It is embedded with the stories that we carry, and the Drunkard's Path quilt pattern was a directive to sort of take the zigzagging trail through the landscape to avoid capture. So there's something for me about all of those things working together that really brings me back to what weaving does or is capable of for viewer and maker. For better and worse, I am always reckoning with the specter of Christianity, I think. And sometimes, even when I'm not conscious on the surface and making, I end up with these things that I see as kind of asking questions of this system and this tool that we've used to understand ourselves in the world, and that has meted out its own violences against bodies that look like mine. And I think I'm always trying to reassert or re-understand um, it as a tool and try to kind of crack it open and find these um, ways to talk back to it, not that it can talk back to me. Um, I think of the reasoning beast as very much a escape ladder from the system that I set up for making these weavings for this show, where it was a quilt pattern and this star thing, and then all those things came together to start to re-inscribe meaning into both systems. And I knew that I was really thinking about navigation. Like that was a big uh, thematic of the show, and navigation towards freedom and away from some of these more damaging or damning things in our lives. And one system that I think a lot of folks in contemporary life are thinking about as a way to navigate to um, maybe a internal or a kind of psychic freedom or understanding of our world and our relationship to each other is the zodiac. So the reasoning beast is, I think of as a sort of self-portrait of the goat, or the Capricorn, which is my sun sign. So I'm going to jump to a different exhibition that's currently on view in Oakville, Ontario at Oakville Gallery. So when the pandemic happened, I had a show scheduled to open last April at Jack Shaman Gallery in New York, and that did not happen. The work was sort of stuck in this limbo, literally in transition or shipping to the gallery. So it was kind of held in space all this time. And then luckily I was able to travel the show as it would have existed at Jack Shaman Gallery to this institution in Canada where it's currently on view. And the sort of thing that I was thinking about as I made this work in 2019, and almost 2 years ago is when it started, was I was meditating on this CDC statistic from 2016 that said within their lifetimes, I can read the actual stat, on February 23rd, 2016, the CDC released a statistic estimating that 1 in 2 Black men who have sex with men will be diagnosed with HIV in their lifetime. And this, the statistic goes on to say this was in contrast to 1 in 6 for the general population of men who had sex with men, to use their language, and 1 in 11 for white men. And so I think it's hard to sit with how stark those statistics are, that 50% of Black men in this group are still going to be kind of facing the brunt of an epidemic or a pandemic that we have long considered over, or far from where it was 40 years prior. And I don't think there's no way that language, as cold and quiet as it may be, sits well in my own spirit. So I really started to think a lot about it. And of the accumulation of bodies in this exhibition, half of them have some sort of marker of a button or a shiny thing, a jewel, a charm on the surface to kind of stand in for the virus. And think about these weavings as sort of time traveling, that they are meditations on the kind of past, present, future of what it looks like to deal with this ailment, this disease. And there's a kind of ritual that's happening in them. There's this attention to things that I've seen or thought about or know about how people deal with disease generally, or not being well. I think even the least spiritual of us turn to some sort of ritual, a way to center ourselves or focus, or physically or emotionally kind of lift ourselves from dealing with our mortality. And so Lifesavers was the only non-figurative work in the exhibition, and it really borrowed an ethos from quilt making, and it is comprised of yarns left over from all of the weavings in the exhibition. And I wove them in this dot pattern to think about the glut of life-saving drugs that someone who is living with HIV and AIDS or someone who is trying to prevent themselves from contracting the virus takes on a daily basis. So I wanted to capture that time component with the kind of calendar or pillbox at the bottom and thinking about um, yeah, that passage of time and the mm, maybe trying to capture some of that hope or mm, that unsayable thing, apparently. And another work from the exhibition. And so I think this is the last work that I show from that exhibition, but um, the catfish is this thing that kind of shows up in my work and has been there for quite some time, and I think of as sort of my spirit animal or guide. And I think there's so many things about it that are um, uniquely and specifically Southern and Black, and I think a lot about how it has been sort of vilified or thought of as an undesirable, and all of these other things that kind of track with the ways that Black folks have been thought about or talked about through history, through media, through literature. Um, and yes, I have more to say about it, but I can wait a moment. And so I'm going to show a few images from an exhibition called The Pond Keepers that was on view here in LA in September at my LA representation of various small fires. Um, I don't know. Through the pandemic, I feel like so many people, I just was like, what do I do? What do I say? What do I make? What do I care about making or saying? And I sat with that for many months, and I just made a body of work that was thinking about a very different uh, pandemic and sort of um, didn't feel like I had anything valuable to say about any of those things at that moment. And so what I turned to was really this research that I've been doing for some time, both in terms of my artwork and just in my own sort of understanding of self, which was looking into the history of my hometown and the surrounding region, which is Mejia, Texas. And there's a small lake um, right outside of city limits with the same name, Lake Mejia. And I just was doing genealogical research, looking into the kind of history of the lake and some of the events that have happened there. It is on one particular parcel of the lake, there's land that freed folks who were enslaved who had been freed, purchased, and started to use as kind of a fairgrounds, a place to celebrate this freedom, which is Juneteenth. And is one of the kind of earliest Juneteenth celebrations in the country, centered in this place that I'm from. So there's all this kind of energy and excitement around emancipation or freedom and liberation to me that like feels like my birthright. Like I'm so excited by it. So I made this group of weavings that had were united by this color color theme, the creatures that were showing up, namely catfish, and this attention to water, to blood, um, kind of land and ancestry were these things that I was thinking through and really taking inspiration from medieval tapestries, and thinking about the unicorn tapestries in particular and how they're united by kind of color and form and imagery, and wanting to tell a story through the medium, thinking about kind of these more contemporary issues. So the catfish, I think, is so connected to life and death. It's a means of sustenance. It's all over the kind of southern and particularly Texan landscape. It is in the food. It is mascots, uh, all kinds of things. And so um, I think their relationship to the depths and the surface and all of these things, it starts to create this kind of closed loop to me of this dying, living, eating this fish, and sort of it becomes sort of ancestor, spirit, and food. So I just always kind of come back to her, to him, to it. There were these events of raising towns in the region in the early 20th century, and late 19th century in the region and throughout the country. And I had not heard about any of these events in relationship to my sort of hometown and its surroundings. But in researching, found out about three of them from the late 1800s to like the 1920s. And also this was a conversation that was being had a lot last year relative to Tulsa, and then relative to just the uprisings of 2020 around George Floyd and Breonna Taylor and Ahmaud Arbery. And I think there were a lot of resonances to the idea of these fires across this kind of 100-year span of time, and thinking about where they overlapped and where they differed, and trying to reckon with that energy, were some of the things kind of bound up in this work. Something that I feel that my work is sort of obsessed with, and that I spend a lot of time thinking about, is water, and Black folks and Black bodies' relationship to that material can be quite fraught. I think from the moment that Black folks unwillingly embarked to come here, there's this relationship to water, to drowning, and I'm often sort of find my attention pulled to local news stories about accidental or intentional drownings of Black bodies, and I find it important and imperative in my work to always try to find ways to look at all the other facets of a kind of tragedy or the potential for one. And so in this piece, I'm just thinking about the joy of swimming, of that pastime, and of being able to be in control of one's body in water. So I want to always make sure that I'm having kind of a holistic view of a thing and celebrating that kind of joy and survival aspect of things, and thinking about that lake as this kind of ancestral place. It becomes, blood red, and that the body having some sort of primacy over the material, it becomes kind of the water sort of mixing up those signifiers a little bit. Big catfish. And I think about often how I'm reading, or how folks are reading queerness into my work, or Blackness into my work, or asking me where the queerness is, or where the Blackness is, or kind of creating this dichotomy, or like making them face off. And I think weaving is such a great um, way to talk about, or a metaphor for my response is. And I think so much of it is that like you can't really pull or parse those things apart. Like if you pull on kind of any thread of that, everything else kind of comes forward with it. So that I think of them so intertwined that it's hard to separate. Is maybe what I'm trying to say there. But in this piece, I think it is maybe one of the most successful and nuanced read of how I'm thinking about the catfish in particular, and ways that I think of it as queer, and um, the ways that it pulls out some of the maybe more uh, issues around desire and desirability, and yeah, gets to the bottom of a lot of these things. Is maybe all that I'll say about that. Um, yeah. So the next few weavings are from a show that I had at Various Small Fires in 2019 that was called Unholy Ghosts, and it borrowed its name from a poem, sort of this epic poem by Essex Hemphill, Black gay man and poet who died of HIV in the early 90s. And I found his work as a young person, and it really started to envision what my life had been like and could be like. And I found it probably 20 to 30 years after he'd written it, and it still felt like he was talking to my experiences. And a lot of what this particular poem, Fathers, Sons, and Unholy Ghosts, um, talked about was um, one's relationship to masculinity. And I think what he is advocating for and really talking about is how critical it is that men and masculinity finds access to tenderness and to reconciliation, and finding ways to resist violence, and all of these things that I think so many of us are engaged in today, in one way or another. And one of the things that he sort of gets at is that if you can repair or mend one of these relationships, right? So like yourself to a brother, yourself to your father, then it sort of has this rippling effect throughout your relationships with these other sort of men in your lives, brother, whether they be brother, father, son, or lover in a lot of our cases. Yeah, so I think these weavings really think about that kind of quest for that repair. And a lot of the figures, or specifically even animals, I think represent sort of some of those ideals, or some of those people, or characteristics that we imbue ourselves with. This is out of order. So dogs often show up in my work as a way to work out my relationship, or Black folks, or queer folks, or other marginalized folks' relationships to the state. So I think of them as stand-ins for the military, industrial complex, or police, or any other sort of state-sanctioned violences that our bodies are met with. And for me, it's a way not to replicate that violence, or the trauma of that violence, or losses, but to call it out in a way that does not disempower myself or folks who share my identities. And as a way to hopefully think about how those dynamics can be reworked, hopefully. And a lot of medieval tapestries are so engaged in thinking about the hunt. And I think it is a way to talk about or retell this story in this contemporary moment, and still honor that kind of tradition. Yeah. more catfish. And as I was saying earlier, I really started to see water as this other actor or other character, other figure in the work. And in this particular work that was a commission for the New Orleans Museum of Art, I'd spent 3 months there in a residency, and then maybe 4 years kind of going back there at every opportunity that I could have. So I was racking up like frequent flyer miles to New Orleans, and going at every moment that I could, because it was the first time that I'd been in a place in the South that felt like all the things that brought me to the West Coast, to San Francisco or California or Oregon, and the way that people were existing there with water in particular, and the ways that stories directions were given weren't, someone wouldn't tell you to head east on this and turn right and left here. It was more like, head away from the lake and towards the river, and you're going to turn on this street that has the name Canal. So that there was sort of water coursing through every kind of dialogue and conversation and orienting oneself to the world. And it just worked on me. And I kind of had already been thinking so much about water, but it was one of the first times that I was having these kind of benign conversations about bodies in relationship to water, and seeing the world and navigating it. And this is sort of something that manifested out of those conversations. And this is from Unholy Ghost, the exhibition I was talking about that happened at VSF in 2019. And I think some of the other thematics of that show were really thinking about birth and rebirth and self-transformation, and thinking about how queer folks are kind of masters at birthing themselves, renaming oneself, having a chosen family, and really wanting to kind of pay attention to that. And so thinking about a lot of these weavings as becoming vessels, or wombs, and thinking about like in that first one with the blue dog, this kind of womb or burrow that the figure is in, thinking about that kind of incubation of oneself. And so this work is from an exhibition that was at the New Museum in 2019, in an exhibition titled Darling Divine, which is on view right now at the Blanton, which is an institution at the University of Texas at Austin. And it brought together a group of works from kind of a 3-year time span, where I'd sort of first began making these figures and animals come together, and really started to think about love, about accessing this sort of calling card of male tenderness that I've become thought to be aligned with, I suppose. And I think for me, it was a way to work out what these people were doing with each other, and how the animals added or amplified some of those ideas and characteristics. And in medieval tapestries, often animals were brought into the work to sort of imbue the patron of the weaving with these kind of noble ideas embodied in a griffin or a unicorn or a dog, and these ideas sort of being like loyalty and strength, and anything that you might put on a wall in a kindergarten class to make the kids feel good about themselves. And I think for me, often I was picking these animals that had some relationship to the South, or to being vilified or thought of as undesirable or irredeemable. And for me, it was to raise them up to the level of tapestry or of nobility, and to also then impart that on these Black figures that were in the work. And I also started to display the works away from the wall. And for me, there was some generosity in allowing the viewer to really start to think about the process and how the work was made, and to see some of the thinking and things that I was allowing for in the work that were um, maybe breaking some conventions of how we understand weavings to be made, um, for craftspeople anyways. Um, and the structure itself references tapestry looms. So there was this way of kind of trying to talk to the medium a little bit, I think, embedded as well. Um, Holy, 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 I think, is one of the very first works that I made where I got this sensation or the sense in myself that I like made something, that it was a success. And this was also, for those of you in school, like one of the last things I made in grad school. So it was, 2 years of making objects and having conversations. And this was one of the first times where I was like, yes, this is good. So yeah, that moment of like, what am I doing, or I am doing it, that being making art, can be delayed. And it is, there was this thing happening in the world in Uganda, a bill that was colloquially called Kill the Gays, was being brought forth to become law, become legislation. And essentially there were all these American politicians and folks inside of Christianity, so these preachers and whoever's, who were helping fund and write this legislation in Uganda. And beyond just being horrifying, that a state-sanctioned violence and death was being proposed, it was to me that Americans were participating in human rights violations. And a lot of the idea that queerness was un-African was not unlike what I'd heard about queerness and Blackness in the States. And so I was really starting to think about how to make a textile that could sort of speak both of these languages and use techniques that were African and European and American would be the third one. And so they also sort of started to bring together a lot of my own identities and the identities that shaped who I was, and that they were inextricable, right? So that you couldn't, like I was saying earlier, pull on one thread and not pull everything else with it, as sort of this affirmation of spirituality, of wholeness, and this kind of idea of deficit that I think was being had in a lot of these conversations, hence the name of kind of holy, 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 playing with language. I think there's maybe one more slide. Two more slides. Something else that was a lot in early work was this interest in nature, but also thinking about, trying to think about the way that I still felt separated from it, or how it felt like with enjoyment or pleasure being derived from it, like there was also this anxiety or fear of being in the natural world and the things that could happen to one while in it. So for me, there was this kind of scrim between really accessing and taking part and enjoying or pulling that pleasure from this thing that also felt horrifying. So I think that these were these kind of first moments of trying to negotiate my relationship to that space. This is the first mature figurative work that I made, and I returned or started to make these figurative things alongside or in tandem with these more geometric abstractions, because I thought that they were speaking the same language, they were coming from the same place, but there were things that I wanted to be explicit about, things that I felt like I could articulate with the body, and I thought these bodies would be safe in public discourse in a way that I had not felt before, because there was this kind of wellspring of Black creatives, both inside the contemporary art world, inside film and television, starting to tell all of these kind of multifaceted stories about Black bodies and Black people and their experiences. And so I felt like we were in a place where there was scaffolding to kind of have nuanced and interesting, exciting conversations about Black folks and their physical bodies, in a way that I had not experienced prior to. I am lying about how many slides there are, so I'm just gonna say that. I have been working through my relationship to Americana, in particular, that red, white, and blue, the flag, for many years. And I made a lot of flags, thought about what they mean and what they don't, and how we think about allegiance, especially to systems that are founded in white supremacy as a non-white, non-straight, like, on and on person. And how I can make it speak to my experiences. And so this piece was in a show titled Allegiance, where I was taking those stars and really starting to think about constellations and liberation and all of these things that are start to swirl for me when I see a star or think about a flag, that I don't think maybe are explicitly embedded in them. And this is the last slide. This work was another commission for the New Orleans Museum of Art, and it was important to me both to work through this mode of abstraction, which for me is so alive with meaning and messages. And so this was an abstraction of a cosmographic or psychogeography of a particular section of New Orleans, that then I use yarns that had dyed in different bodies of water throughout that landscape to really think about the ways that that place feels like it moves in the way that the sort of current or water does. And I think this is also this kind of articulation of thinking about these natural materials, their relationship to these landscapes and places, and histories that I have been so interested in thinking about throughout my practice. I think that's it.
Yay, wonderful, Diedrick. Thank you so much for sharing. It was amazing to see. You have been busy. A brand new body of works, or so I wanted to also introduce Anu. Sorry, I forgot to say at the very beginning, Anu, curator and scholar, will be helping to lead the Q&A now. So please
give us your questions, please.
Yeah.
So I'll start with my first question. Give some folks time to add. You can use the Q&A or the chat function. Diedrick, I had the pleasure of seeing your show at the New Museum, and I know you showed some work from that exhibition. One of the things I thought was really striking about that exhibition, because it was on that first floor space with the glass window, that you could really see the paintings not only from front and back, but also from the side, and they had a kind of an occupying of space. So I thought that was really interesting in terms of the installation of the show. Would you speak a little bit more about crossing boundaries in this way. Your work is simultaneously 2D and 3D. It's simultaneously painting and textile. And that's part of what makes it so fascinating. So would you talk about that a little?
Absolutely. I think a lot of that has been accrued over the years. Like, I think I was so sort of focused in on them being textiles and weavings and participating so much in that conversation, and going to an undergrad where fiber was almost siloed, and then going to a graduate school where it's like the person next door is a photographer, the person on the other side was a painter but is now trying to work out performance, that I started to question, like, well, where is my place in this? And over half of the students were painters. And so just by virtue of dialogue, I was just always talking to painters. And it was exciting to me, I think, to think about like the way they thought about color and the picture plane, and like why they wouldn't paint the sides of a stretcher, and like things that I was just like, I would never trouble this. But now that I'm in a place where like these are the conversations, it was like a new way to think about skill, a new way to think about conventions. And it was like I could augment my own thinking and started to move color across the threads in a different way. And I think, something that does come up a lot is the way that they're painterly. And I think it's all like ode to that kind of cohort of painters.
It also makes me think, though, of that famous Annie Albers quote where she says that being a weaver forced her to reckon with a certain reality that painters don't have to reckon with because they can do everything with illusion.
Right.
Any thoughts on that?
Yeah, no, it's true. And I think that there is like, there are things that I can't quite access in thread, but I think I'm always like attempting to like, oh, how do I push the horizon back? I can't really, but maybe I can like change the weft color here, um, or I let it fall, and I know that like a viewer can start to build back that scaffolding. So I think I have times where I'm like, well, I won't weave this, I'll just stitch a line here. Or I start to think a lot about drawing, I think, like that kind of, that drawing or sketching is preparatory, it's never the work. And for me, I'm like, oh, I can invite in some of the spirit of drawing, because I think it's the artist thinking, but it also is the viewer thinking. Like there's something about those sorts of articulation that it's like, I'm asking you to do the work of like suspending reality. Yeah.
Wonderful, thank you. So we have a couple of questions from the public. Gubenga says, what was it like growing up as a queer Black man in such a small town in Texas, and how has that influenced your work? Do you see craft arts as a way of communicating these queer and Black stories to Black, Southern, and rural communities, often uninvolved in contemporary art conversation? And I might just add to that, have you been able to show your work in the South? And what was your experience of that?
Oh, I love this question. Yes, to showing it in the South. So I've been able to show in a few places in Texas in the recent past, in Alabama, in North Carolina, and I was confused with the Carolinas, which is embarrassing. I'm a grown person. And I think the conversations I have about the work there, what I find anyways, is they always resonate in a way that I don't expect. Like, I think as folks inside the art world, we have misconceptions or preconceptions about like what people know about art that don't always hold up. So like, I've had conversations that like blow my mind with people who are just like, I think they have a different relationship to craft in particular, and to work that is about them in some sense, or like includes Black bodies, for instance, that they've become like these savvy and interesting contributors in ways that like, a show in New York does not have the same resonance or audience or viewership, or they don't come with the same sort of experiences to even think about like a big open sky, for instance, right? Or like what that might impart as a small thing. And there was some other facet of that I was supposed to answer. So my family is from this small town in Texas of like 6,000 people. But my father was in the Army. We moved around a bit. And so I think so much about my life was oriented towards Texas, whether I was living there or not. And when I was, I think there was so much embrace of me being an artist, and community that I found inside, like where maybe there was tension around my queerness, like I was still in this sort of like community that was about my family and Blackness and Southernness and ruralness and all of those things that I think were still so lifting, that yeah, I think I always felt supported to sort of to be me and be strange and do things that I think might seem unexpected.
Thank you. Okay, our next question, is from, sorry, I'm having trouble reading. Yas has asked, I'm really enjoying this holistic overview of your practice. I'm sorry, I can't tell if it's Yaz or Yas, so forgive me for mispronouncing your name. And the question is, I feel like you approach the various challenging themes with some hope. Does your practice help you to process personal challenges? There does seem to be some optimism, perhaps, or hopefulness in your work. Is that intentional?
Absolutely. I think it's partly because, on a maybe personal level, I feel pretty upbeat as a person. But I also think like, what's it for? If like I want to point towards like problems and uh, the issues, the hardship, the trauma, like all of these things, but I also think I see in the world like hopeful things happen, and like I want to figure out how to communicate those things in the work. And I don't want to be the person who's like, the apocalypse is now. Although sometimes I feel that way, but I'm like, well, why would I get out of the bed if I didn't think there was a kind of possible alternative? I want to be part of like showing what that might look like, or what I'm experiencing sort of on that intimate daily level. Yeah.
It's so interesting too. I mean, listening to what you're saying and thinking about the next question that came up, I just kind of want to bridge them with this idea around the South. So the next question from Haley is, thank you so much for sharing your work with us. It's so special. As a fellow Black queer creator making art in an obviously white dominated art world, I'm curious to hear how you navigate showing such personal work in spaces that aren't historically safe for marginalized bodies and identities. So I think this is a really interesting question too. And I kind of want to dig in a little bit more, maybe also because we're in LA and we have some of our like coastal bias into like, what do we think the South is? And what is the South? Because when I hear you talk about hopefulness, I also think about like, for someone in your body, it's probably a better time to be living in the South than at any other time in American history, right? Like, not that it's perfect, but it's certainly, you're safer, you're more prosperous, you're more supported, more recognized, more visible, potentially more politically represented than ever before. So I'm kind of curious about that too. Like, is the museum the first time you experienced showing your work in a space that might not be safe for Black bodies? Are there other spaces where you might show that feel more or less safe? And sort of what is your relationship to the museum? Because the questioner is asking, how do you deal with the potential tension that can arise showing work that deals with your identity in white spaces that may gloss over, misrepresent, or even fetishize the true meaning and the depth of this work? Big, heavy question.
Anu and Haley, y'all are like really, it's a heavy hitter. I think it's complicated, especially in the sense that like, I would say as a Black queer person, like I fell in love with art before I realized any of the problems of it, right? Before I knew anything about the institution being the university or the museum or the gallery, like I was already like, this is my passion, this is what I will do. And you don't find those things out until you're in it, right? So then you're like, oh, how do I make sense or meaning or any of this or that? And I think some of it is trial and error, unfortunately. Some of it is community and having mentors and folks in your life who've been there who are willing to share those experiences. And I would say to share them with you, and that you have to be vulnerable enough to share them with them, right? Because like, I think I've gone through things quietly in sort of the the commercial side of things or the institutional side of things. And then later had someone be like, that happened to me, or like, I'm experiencing this now. And then I'm like, oh, I should have downloaded this with these people because I could share like ways to safely navigate or introduce them to people or resources. And so I think that that's part of what we forget. Like we get to these places because people have helped us, and we stay in these places because there are people who can help us. And I think about sort of, injecting myself into the work is sort of what this question is around, like the white dominant art world, and the fetishizing part of it is like, oh God, I would say one of the tactics that I used in the beginning was very intentionally about abstraction, like that I thought I could say what I wanted and like really communicate the truths of my work without ever depicting a body, and that in not doing so, I resisted some of that kind of the ways that someone then might misrepresent or imbue the work with meaning or fetishize it. And I don't know that that's true, or it's like that works exactly. And I think for me, it has become a lot of sort of getting to be the person who tells a viewer what the work is about, like creating the parameters that it's shown in, and insisting on a lot of those conversations before the work even sees the public. And I think honestly, so much of that is still out of your control. But what is stabilizing to me is that I know that people like me will enter the institution and get to make meaning of that work and have an experience with it. And like that was me as a student. Like I was the person who was like, the work was there for, even if it had all these other agendas under it. I try really to think about it, about that audience member, about myself and my relationship to the work, and like centering that as I make decisions around it. I hope that's helpful.
Definitely. Okay, we have one more question and we have time for one more, so that's perfect. So Samuel is asking, oh, Andy has a question too. Well, Andy, I'm not sure we're going to get to you. We'll see how long this next one takes. Thank you for your generosity, sharing your time and your work with us today, says Samuel. Your work is having me think about the use and display of art objects. So this is a craft question, which is pretty interesting. Are they used, quote unquote, outside of the museum space? Do they complicate what we experience as the separation between museum space and living space? So as an artist who works with and comes from a practice of craft, how do you think about that question of use value in your artwork, where you're making objects that aren't necessarily being used? And do you ever make objects that are used in a physical manner aside from their art value?
I can answer both of these questions.
Okay.
I'm reading. Yes and no. In the beginning, I came to fiber after I had already decided to make art objects. So there were lessons, there were other students who were making functional things, like, and I think about that as like clothing, scarves, kitchen utensils, et cetera, et cetera. But I was already like, nope, like I'm making art, I just happen to be weaving. And I think as I've gone along, I've really started to think a lot about that again. And even I think about use more broadly in terms of even like how performative making a weaving is or a basket is, and how much of that gets lost once it comes into a gallery, and trying to find ways to return that. I think tentatively it's been through showing both sides of a weaving. It's putting photographs showing these baskets being used into space as a way to like reassert for myself and for a viewer, like that there is something else that happens that imbues this object with this something that is not typical of maybe other modes of working. And some of my weavings, I'm like, someone who here maybe who shouldn't hear this, some of them I have used and like taken out into the world and like had a picnic upon, or like very simple gestures, but to me that like honor what they are about or do. And the question about I've skimmed it, but I think I understand the question. How do I think about the edges of the panels, or like,
Mhm.
I mean, the question of like, there's unevenness to things, things sort of get wonky. For me, are really this question about craft and trying to extend um, what craft can and can't do. And I think craft, and more specifically fiber, I think has a long way to go and ask questions of itself as a medium. That like painting has had these moments of deconstruction and like what I think of as the freak out. Sculpture has done this. Ceramics has done this, and I think there is the idea of sloppy craft in the fiber world. Um, but I think we're still tentative, and we have so much more to ask ourselves around like what makes good craft, what is mastery, what is its value, and how can we become more emotive, and what happens when we break some of those rules, what possibilities are out there, and who does that let in to the medium, and why do people feel pushed out by it? um, yeah, and I think it's just, I don't want content and craftsmanship or craftspersonship to like um, limit one or the other. So I think that for me, there is this gesture in like getting people to look at that, and also by virtue think about the content and why a thing might appear to be unraveling or lopsided, or any number of other sort of states of being.
Yeah, think about when I look at your weavings, especially the one they do have threads at the bottom, um, that it's also kind of a virtuosity mark, right? Like for other weavers to see that you did this inherent within the material. It's like how painters don't paint quite to the edge just to make the point that like, I didn't have to edit anything. Yeah.
Right. Yes.
Wonderful. Thank you so much for talking us through your process today. It's been fascinating, and we're very much looking forward to having you in the seminar. So VAST students and Diedrick, we'll take 5 or so. Let's reconvene at 3:15, actually, so that's 7 minutes from now. So again, breather, get away from the screen for a minute. Let's all go outside, breathe some semi-clean air, and then come back.
All right.
Thank you so much. Have a great day, everybody.